Welcome to Unite Now, conversations at the intersection of leadership and flourishing. As you know, if you have been traveling with us the last few months, we've been talking all things collaboration. We've been talking theology of collaboration, philosophy of collaboration, elements, important kind of keys and elements to collaboration. And today, for this month, I'm super excited to have with me Gloriana Teh and just to talk about some of the concrete practical elements of like how do you collaborate, what's involved in the process, important things to remember, and that sort of thing. So welcome to the conversation, and thank you, Gloriana, for being with us. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and some of your background?
Hi, Ruth. Thanks for having me. So I've been on the board with Unite, currently serving as its vice president. Chip and Brian introduced me to Unite, and it was something I really resonated with as far as the vision that Unite's trying to do with partnering with churches in Atlanta. And I've lived in Metro Atlanta since 2005. A little bit about me: I'm married. I have a daughter. She's in third grade. We have a 2-year-old puppy. Um, and I've been managing projects for over 15 years, leading and working with cross-functional teams. And I recently launched my own firm, Claritas Consulting and Coaching. The goal is to enable individuals and organizations to unlock value from their data. I feel like we live in this information age where there's so much data or information, it can get overwhelming sometimes, especially when we're dealing with complicated situations. And I'd love to be able to come alongside in those type of situations and help people get to a point where they can say, it's clear now. Now, it may not be simple, but it's clear. Typically, once you get to that point, it's easier to identify where we want to go to next. And so that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. So you've been doing project management, and can you help kind of connect the dots for us about how project management and collaboration are linked? Like, what do they have to do with each other?
Yes, that's a good question. If we can, we'll go back to the definitions because for me, definitions I find to be helpful sometimes. So, what's a project? The Project Management Institute, or PMI, defines a project as a temporary endeavor. Let me make sure I say this correctly. To undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So it doesn't have to be a thing. It can be a service. It can be an outcome, and it's temporary. So the definition of collaboration. This is out of the Cambridge Dictionary. They define it as the situation of two or more people working together to create or achieve the same thing, or the act of working together with other people or organizations to create or achieve something. So if people are meeting together, but there's not a specific goal in mind, that's not necessarily collaboration. We could call that networking. Maybe they're at a conference together. But what projects and collaboration have in common is that they are trying to achieve something. Now, with projects, you don't have to have more than one person. Some projects are individual projects, and there is no team. The other slight difference is with projects, it's always something that's not been done before, whereas which makes it sometimes a little bit more complicated because there are more unknowns associated with certain types of projects. So the the other thing is with projects, I think typically there's more of a defined beginning and a defined end, whereas with collaboration that can be a little bit more fluid. So to give you an idea, the project teams that I worked with and led, they were quite diverse in terms of geography as well as group composition. So this is before COVID. We were working remotely with remote teams. So we had scientists in Switzerland. I had business people in Atlanta, and teams of engineers, technicians in Tennessee. We were all trying to work together. This is on one particular program. And we had to collaborate. It's not possible to work on that type of a project without collaborations. It's really essential to bring in the skill sets and the perspectives that you need to achieve that. So one other thing is some managers at the company that I worked at used to explain that they they felt it was easier to be a department manager than to be a project manager because you had people reporting to you. Whereas when you're managing a project, nobody reports to you. So I was thinking about this, about, our pastors and community leaders. Their job is even harder than a project manager because not only do these people not report to them, right? That's not even their main task or job. They're doing things just because they feel there's a need or they're volunteering for certain things. And so this adds a whole nother dimension to collaboration. From that perspective.
So you were mentioning scientists and engineers, and you're kind of bringing these very different groups together to collaborate. And I'm sure, the different groups have different interest areas, things that they're passionate about, even like maybe intuitive ways that they might approach a project. And so I'm just curious, bringing those kinds of groups together, how easy is that? How difficult is that? Like, what are some components that need to happen in order for you to really be successful together?
So, yes, that's interesting. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. So I think for me, relating to the scientists and the engineers is a little bit easier. But even within those groups, and then we bring in other groups like regulatory and, our commercial teams and finance. And that's, I remember saying to my boss at the time, I said, I feel like sometimes I'm an English translator because everybody's speaking English, but maybe not necessarily saying the same things. So I think obviously listening is important, and just trying to see things from their perspective, where the comment or the question or the concern might be coming from, and asking clarifying questions as far as to understand, what they're trying to communicate.
That's really good. That's really good. It makes me think. So, I think you and I had talked about at one point that Harvard did a study. I think was it Harvard that did the study about like collaboration and the most important kind of factors that are involved with healthy collaboration. Was that Harvard?
That was Google. You're thinking of, I think, Professor Amy Edmondson. She's from Harvard Business School.
Oh,
So she coined this term, psychological safety. I don't know if some people have heard of it or not. I'm sure some have. And Google did a study. It's called Project Aristotle. And Google's a data company, as we all know. They were trying to figure out what made for good teams. Like, what was it about certain teams where they just worked really well together? So they looked at all different factors. Were these people in the same time zone? Did they bring in, complementary skill sets? Did they meet remotely or not? Was it a personality differences or things like that? Do you need certain types of people to be on that team? They could not find any significant correlation. So then they started looking at group norms instead. And so what they found is that in teams where people felt like they could speak openly and bring up concerns or bring up, ideas, these were the teams that were the ones that were successful. So psychological safety, this phrase that Professor Amy Edmondson came up based on her research on teams means it's a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And I clearly remember I heard about this term in an audio. I was listening to an audiobook and it was this term came up. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's it. You know, because a while back, this is many years ago, my boss asked me, he said, Gloriana, your teams are really motivated. And what is it that you're doing? I couldn't explain it to him. My answer at the time, I think I said I tried to provide the team with a clear understanding why they were doing this project, why it mattered. And though that's not a wrong answer, it really didn't seem like it was a complete answer. And so when I heard of this term, I was like, oh, wow, that's, part of it. And I'm still learning. Like there's not all, there's situations where I'm sure I don't always, I'm doing something that may jeopardize psychological safety, but it's I was doing it unconsciously, and just to be able to give some language around that and to help people understand the importance of it, I think is pretty powerful.
That's really good. So, I feel like, some of the elements of psychological safety, it was sort of embedded in the definition you gave, but just curious if, like, how would a leader create psychological safety for the team that they were leading, or even how would the participants in the group help sort of contribute to psychological safety for the other members of the group?
If I can, let's maybe start with an example. This is more probably on the member side, and then we'll get to the leaders. How's that? So I don't know if you've ever heard of, it's called the Marshmallow Challenge by Peter Skillman. And this is not where the little kids have to sit on their hands and not eat the marshmallow. There's that experiment that maybe some people have heard of. And so this one, it's an experiment and it's been replicated multiple times. So 4 participants, and you have 18 minutes, and they're teams of 4. The goal is to build the tallest structure possible, and the only rule is that the marshmallow has to end up on top. So the participants get 20 pieces of uncooked spaghetti, a yard of tape, a yard of string, and 1 regular marshmallow. And they did this originally with teams of kindergartners and teams of MBA students. So who would you think won the challenge?
Well, you would
Go
think the
ahead.
MBA students, but
You
I'm
hope,
guessing.
you hope the MBA students won the challenge. How tall do you think their structures were, these MBA students?
Hmm.
How many inches?
Oh, inches. We're talking inches.
Yes, inches.
Wow. 12 inches?
Close. Yes, 10 inches. What about
10.
the kindergartners? How tall do you think their structures ended up averaging?
Well, it has to be higher than 10, I'm assuming. So let's say 18 inches.
26 inches.
Wow.
Yes, over 2.5 times taller than the MBA students. They did
That's
this with teams
crazy.
of lawyers, and they're about 15 inches for the lawyers. I don't know if they've ever tried it with pastors. I don't know what that would end up being. So they've done it with different groups. You could try this with your team as well. If you're curious, just it's probably a good team bonding type experiment. So when they were watching the participants, what do you think were some of the differences between how these MBA students interacted and the kindergartners from a collaboration standpoint?
That's a great question. I mean, in some ways, I imagine kindergartners are more like creative and prone to take because there are less sort of like intellectual sort of boundaries that they put around things, right? So it's like, I wonder if this would work. I wonder if this, let's try this. So I feel like the curiosity would be higher. But tell me, please. I'm excited to hear.
You're right. That's one of the items. We'll actually come back to that. Maybe a little. We'll talk about that more maybe a little later. The main thing for the collaboration side, I think, is the kindergartners, they just started getting to work. They had no, the MBA students, there was a little bit of trying to read the room, how people are interacting, maybe a little bit of jockeying for position, who's leading here. And the kindergartners, none of that. They just started, they went at it, and as they say, there's a lot of what we need to know we learned in kindergarten.
That's interesting. So on that point, that it just sounds like in some ways it's like less ego, right? It's not, and sort of less of this like sort of interpersonal sort of who's going to be better, how do I show up, all of that kind of internal maybe chaos that can happen when you're trying to get going on a project.
Yeah, some of that, and also probably less inhibition as far as fear of judgment.
Right.
If I
Yes.
do something or suggest something, what if they think it's a bad idea, or how are they going to react to what I say? That can also play a part in as far as psychological safety and
That's really
collaboration.
good. And that feels super important because I feel like that happens when we bring different people into a room like so whether it's like, hey, here's a pastor of a really large church and a pastor of a small church, here's a pastor of a church um, that has a lot of resources or members, here's a pastor of a church that has a small amount of members, here's a pastor of a church that is white or black or Hispanic or Asian. Like, as people get into the room, I feel like it's so easy for sort of that like internal monologue to start happening about what are they thinking, what are their intentions, how are they going to receive this, what do they mean by that, and then even that like so that's the like in that like internalization of how are they seeing me, but then also like I can't believe that person said that. And yeah, so I feel like it can be so easy when people are working on a project to kind of get into that space, both of like questioning how people are experiencing us as we show up in the room, as well as us judging or bringing sort of criticism about some how someone else is showing up in the room. Um,
As a leader, there's quite a bit that you can do as far as when we want to influence. Again, this is a group norm, right, that we're trying to influence. So sharing what, just the language again, this term, psychological safety, so people can say, hey, I don't quite feel safe. They can, even that's not during a meeting, maybe it's after the meeting, but those conversations can happen. And um, as a leader, encouraging people to speak up and comment. You can do this as a team member too, right? You don't necessarily have to be a leader to do this. And for the leaders to acknowledge from the team that they want their input, because this will help the team members. Maybe it's your congregation, feel like, yes, that they know that you want to hear from them, and to acknowledge once they do provide that input, to acknowledge that it's been received. It doesn't mean we can't do everything that people ask for, right? But we can acknowledge that that's been received, because that creates a feedback loop so that in the future, people will want to speak up again. So as much feedback as we can provide, so people really feel that they've been heard. That's very important to creating this environment of psychological safety. It's not that we have to know the answers, so actually admitting that we don't have all the answers helps as well in creating this environment, because then people feel like it's okay, to be more open, as far as with where they are, and some level of vulnerability is healthy in a team. The other thing when leading a team is you can have regular start, stop, continue conversations with team members. to ask for feedback. And the frequency really depends on what it is you're trying to do. And this can be with your direct if you have staff, then it can be with staff. If it's just team members, it can be with team members as well. I'll give an example as far as where, I learned a lot from one of these conversations. I was working with a client, and they were based in the Midwest. And I've worked for an American company before, a European company before. And with the European company, they really preferred direct communication. That was expected for you to be very straightforward as far as from a communication style. And I had kind of circled back around with my team members after a month or two to just see how things were going. And one of them explained to me, she told me, Gloriana, this company, they're very gentle as far as their communication style. I was coming across, I needed to change the way I was communicating so that they could feel safer as far as being able to speak up. And so that's important, especially when you're going into a new situation and we have team members that we may not know as well. There are different things different people have different things that will cause them to feel unsafe. So for some people, the way I was communicating would be no issue at all. For others, maybe that made them a little bit more hesitant as far as how how much they wanted to speak up. The other thing can be with just styles as far as for certain folks, the fear is to be excluded from the group. Or if they feel like, oh, I might not be, people may not want me to join in on certain activities or invite me along for everything and that's where it comes from. So a lot of times it's this reaction to a certain trigger. And sometimes you can try and guess, but with established teams, this becomes easier. That's why in this day and age, I think this is why it's so challenging, right? Is because our teams are not constant. They're changing. There's a lot of turnover in positions within organizations. And Professor Amy Edmondson, she has a great, if you look up on TED Talk, about the difference between teams and teaming. And she likens teams with basketball teams. Professional or college or otherwise, but they are set. Whereas teaming is like a game of pickup basketball. And those team members are a lot more fluid and they come in and out. So our environment is probably somewhere in the middle where we don't have, there are people shifting and understanding how to build. You talked about trust, actually. That's one other part. So when we talk about psychological safety as this group norm, trust is more of an individual norm, but it's between individuals, right? So if we can increase trust between individuals, we can also help to foster psychological safety within the group.
Just like recognizing, hey, a lot, like when you're building a house, a lot is happening prior to seeing construction actually take place. And so, even when you're like talking about stakeholders, like I guess with the house, it's like, who is the loan officer, who is going to do the building components, who's going to be the electrician, like what stakeholders are involved, the family that is going to live there, what are their needs, what are they looking for, and so figuring out all of those things, and then what the blueprint is going to be, and then laying this foundation. That's all sort of has to happen before construction happens, because if you're like 3 months into construction, it was like, oh wait, we needed an extra bathroom, or that bathroom isn't going to work there because there's no place for the sewage to go, or whatever, can cause a lot of challenges, right? So, um, yes, that makes a lot of sense of like being sort of really diligent about following the process and not skipping to action prematurely. Um, are there other errors that you have seen people kind of tend to make when leading collaborative process?
Yeah, so there's two others that come to mind, and another one is not building in feedback loops. So I'll give an example. I used to work with R&D groups where the chemists would develop formulated project products, and they would meet with sales and marketing to understand what what do the customers want. They'd go off and work on it for months and then come back with a sample. And sometimes, they had promised that customer a sample at a certain point in time. But during this whole process of them developing the sample, something was missed, because it's easy to miss things in communication, right? So they bring the sample, and then the response was, well, this isn't what we were asking for. And now all of a sudden it's a major issue, because the customer's been promised something and it really throws everything off. And a good way to avoid this is really by building in feedback loops. So in in IT software type project where they work in an agile manner, these feedback loops are very, very rapid, right? I mean, they happen, and part of it is the nature of the product, because software can be easily changed. When you have a registered product or something physical, and there's a mold, or if it's a huge conference that you're planning, like certain things just have to be done at certain times. And so that's why these feedback loops are important, to make sure we are understanding correctly. And it's that for to reduce the amount of miscommunication that can occur, the impact of that. And this also comes back with, remember we were talking about the marshmallows, and you had said the kindergartners, they were willing to take risks and try things. Well, this is where, you know, and basically one of the things they found is the kindergartners would start putting that marshmallow as part of the structure and iterating very, very quickly. Whereas with the MBA students, because they're just wired to think about planning, and that marshmallow, by the time they got it on top, it could be not a whole lot of time left to redo. So this goes back to that same concept of building in some iterations. The other thing from a timing standpoint is on the back end. We've talked a lot about the front end, what we want to try and do on the front end, but the back end, oftentimes there's not enough time built in for acceptance or buy-in. And think about it from this standpoint. The project team or your team has been planning for months, and whoever the end customer is, or whoever you're trying to serve, probably knows very little about the actual product or initiative that's trying to be launched. They've heard about it, but they don't really know much about it. And by the time you're ready to launch, right, the customer, it's not like they've had all this time to really process and think about and do that. And so there has to be some time allowed for them to understand and accept and ask some questions, as far as, oh, okay, so now, this is what it's going to be. And the concept around that comes actually from Six Sigma. And you're probably like, why in the world is she talking about Six Sigma? And there's this equation in Six Sigma. Six Sigma comes from GE and Toyota were huge promoters of this, as far as trying to build more efficient processes, right? But there are learnings that we can take away from that. And One of them is this equation. It's called excellence equals quality times acceptance. So when we talk about buy-in, acceptance, that is, it's very important that, and when you, no matter how good your idea is, that's the quality side, right? Maybe it's a horrible idea. It's only a 4. Well, it's not going to go anywhere. But let's say you've got a wonderful idea and it's a 9. This is a multiplication. It's not a, we're not talking about addition. So it doesn't matter if that idea is a 10. If there's not at least a level of buy-in at a 6, I mean, that's only 60 points. That's not great, but maybe it's enough. So we really have to have a certain level of acceptance uh, for whatever it is that you're working on to be able to gain traction and really have impact, because I mean that's really what we're trying to do is have impact and make change, um, for the good to further the kingdom.
Can you, so I feel like you kind of talked around a little bit about like what's required in order to get acceptance or buy-in, but could you kind of connect the dots of like how would we get buy-in? How does that process work? Are you talking about like buy-in from like the product standpoint, who's going to use the product, or the collaborators who are creating the product?
You need both, right? The first has to happen, and I think a lot of what we've talked about before this really helps explain how to build that for the beginning. And don't forget the end. Don't forget that even though you have that buy-in from the core team, right? There needs to be space and time allowed built into literally the timeline to allow for that to happen at the end. Because otherwise, people are going to feel like they're just trying to push something down my throat.
Collaboration can be such a long process and it's not always easy, right? And yet, at Unite, we really believe it's worth it. And I'm just curious if you could give any examples of a collaborative process that you've seen that has really just accomplished really cool and beautiful things.
Yeah, so collaboration, I agree. It's not easy, but it can be very rewarding. And collaboration with, there's challenges with both small groups and as well as large groups. So I have a client, it's a Fortune 500 company. So this is a very large organization. You don't have to have a large organization to collaborate. It can be done with smaller organizations and different size organizations together. The challenge when you have these large organizations is their silos and needing to be able to break down those silos in between divisions and departments. So that was the type of project that I was walking into. It felt almost like there were two teams within the project. And this was not a very big core team to begin with. But what ended up happening is, in a matter of about 5 months, that those two teams were collaborating not just with each other but with other regional teams. And I think that the part that's really satisfying is one of the managers was saying, Gloriana, I was a detractor at the beginning and now I'm a promoter. And him and one of the other colleagues, they were using some of the learnings, taking that to other project teams that they were working in within the company. And so, from going where some of our teammates were saying, oh, there's not enough data, there's, no matter how big you are, you're always going to feel, you can feel like, we don't have enough to start. Don't let that deter you. Like, start with what you have there and just build off of that. Start somewhere. And once you start and people see the value that the collaboration can bring, more and more people will get on board. The other example, one of the groups I was involved with, we actually had a very small team. We were the smallest team in our department. And we were working on some of the largest projects in our division. And so how is that possible? How are we, able to work on these really large projects? And it's because of collaboration, because we were collaborating with other divisions, with other departments, with larger groups. And so, leading that type of effort, it's very satisfying because you see like the power of collaboration and what it can do. And when we have teams that are collaborating well, it's such a joy to be able to work together.
Okay, so Gloriana, we have gone a lot of different directions. We've talked through a lot of different points. I'm curious if you could just sort of, as we're wrapping up, kind of rapid fire or not rapid fire, but if you could kind of go through the high level points just to refresh our memory of like, hey, what's this like collaborative process look like?
So the first step would be, I think, to get clear on the goal and include your stakeholders in developing that goal. Then build a team that wants to work towards that same goal, build psychological safety within the team, and build time in for iterations and acceptance. So I don't know if that's uh, oversimplifying it, but it really, it just some encouragement. You're already doing parts of this already. It's really just trying to provide a framework around thinking about where to do these different things that you've been doing and putting it all together.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for bringing your sort of expertise from the work world that you've lived in to us as sort of this framework to help us as we're thinking about engaging communities. Because I think, yeah, you in your line of work, or, I think you had mentioned initially that project management came out of like just like construction, right? The like construction field, and it's like, this is geared towards creating a beautiful, functional building that meets needs and accomplishes purposes. And that's what we're trying to do as the church and community, right? We're trying to create something that is beautiful and functional and that really serves the community that we're in and meets needs. And so thank you for just sort of bringing these tools and this process to us to be able to apply in a whole other kind of space. Thanks for being with us. And thank you for those of you who've joined the conversation. We always look forward to just journeying together as we seek to engage community, know our communities deeply, and engage to spark flourishing within our communities.